Faith is having your peace in God when it doesn't seem reasonable. It's hope that exceeds the problem. Because Jesus is there. He is there. We sang that song, I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. And I pray that's our heart, that we would rather have Jesus than anything. We'd rather have Jesus than anything. He is the focus of our hearts. When everything is boiled down to it, He's all we need and He's all we want. Okay? Because there's a difference there. There's a difference there. We always need water. We always need food, but we don't always want those things. We want them when we can really feel the need, but do we want them all the time? How do we feel about Jesus? Are we always about Him this way, that we are constantly focused on Him? We are focused on what He did for us on the cross at Calvary and how He was raised from the dead. Is He what Hebrews calls that soul anchor? That kind of theology about God, that kind of thought that we have about God that roots us. It's everything to us. I pray that we're that kind of people. But there's an interesting story that I read about a rooster. Okay. I've never had chickens. I really don't have any desire to have chickens. I'll just go buy my chicken at the store. But I read a story about a rooster. And a rooster is in there in the yard of his master. And he's around all the other chickens in the coop. And they're just roaming around and they're looking for grains and bugs and things like that. And here's that rooster strutting around and he's pecking up all the grains he can find. And as he goes around the house, suddenly, instead of finding a grain, he pecks down and pulls up a diamond. He pulls up a diamond. Somehow it had maybe come out of a ring or come out of a necklace of the wife of the home. But he finds a diamond, and he's holding that big diamond in his beak. And he turns to the other chickens, and he's upset. And he says, if my master had found this, he'd put it back in its place, because maybe it would be worth something to him. But he said, I'd rather have all the seed in the world, or I'd rather have just one more seed than all of these jewels in the world. Because he doesn't understand the value of the jewel. Here's a rooster in all of his arrogance, strutting around, pecking at everything except what matters. He essentially is missing the forest for the trees. And I think sometimes that we are like that. Sometimes we're like that. Sometimes we peck around at all sorts of things and we miss the diamond. We miss what's most important. Is that not the case with us a lot of times? And then we pursue those things that we've been pecking at. They don't give us the things that we want. We end up in a low place, and we end up reaching out to the Lord and saying, Lord, you're all I need. These other things don't satisfy. These other things don't do that for me. What if Jesus were to tell us what the diamond is for Him? What if Jesus were to tell us what is His singular focus and mission? What if God were to show us what His singular focus and mission is? Would we make that ours? Would we make that the soul anchor? Would we make that everything in our hearts? It's a short passage we have this morning. It's really a one-sided conversation, a monologue. Jesus to His disciples. It says this in verse 43, and all were astonished at the majesty of God. But while they were all marveling at everything He was doing, Jesus said to His disciples, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask Him about this saying. Short passage for this morning, but I think it tells us some very important things about Jesus' focus, about God the Father's focus. You know, this passage, to give us a little bit of background and bring us up to speed, this passage comes on the tail end of a string of miracles that Jesus has done. You remember back a couple of chapters, Jesus has already told his disciples that he's going to be delivered over to the priests and the scribes. They're going to crucify him, and he's going to be raised up on the third day. And even then, they didn't understand, did they? In fact, you realize that they really don't get it, because when he told them that, it comes on a string of miracles, and they've got all these hopes that Jesus is going to be the new David, and he's going to reign in this era of ruling over the world. The Romans will no longer rule over them and master them. No, Jesus is here. He's doing all these miracles. He's casting out demons. He's raising people from the dead. And you remember they're in Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus turns to the disciples and he says, "Who do the people say that I am?" And they give him a list of answers. And then he says, "But who do you say that I am?" You remember Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Peter, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven." There's this great monumental time here where Peter confesses Jesus rightly. He confesses him as the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the chosen one of God, the one who's going to lead the people of Israel. But Peter really doesn't have a grip on what that means exactly. Because right after that passage, right after that little incident, it says that Jesus began to tell them how he would be handed over. He'd be delivered into the hands of men, and he'd be crucified and be raised on the third day. And you remember Peter's reaction? This is recorded in Matthew 17. You remember Peter's reaction? He says, "This will never happen to you. You'll never be crucified. We won't allow that to happen." And what does Jesus say to him? He says, "Get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking about the things of God, but the things of men." And Peter kind of missed the forest for the trees here. He's pecking at the wrong things, and he misses the jewel that Jesus is after. He misses the focus that Jesus is after. Well, shortly after this, that account of Peter's confession of Jesus, he continues to do these miracles. He heals the woman with the issue of blood. You remember the woman who touches the hem of his garment, and suddenly she's healed. And he's doing that. He's healing that woman on his way to heal a man's daughter, a man named Jairus. And by the time he gets to Jairus' daughter, she's dead. And they're all mocking him, and they say, "We know what a dead body looks like." And he says, "No, she's just asleep." And they're laughing at him. And he goes into the room, and he tells her to get up. And the dead girl's alive. And they're amazed. And then what happens? Jesus feeds 5,000 men, not including the women and the children. He feeds anywhere from 8,000 to 15,000 people at one time from 5 loaves and 2 fish. Suddenly these aspirations or these assumptions of what the Messiah should be start to come back, and they say, well, maybe Jesus is going to feed everybody on the planet now. Maybe Jesus is going to conquer all sickness and all disease now. Maybe now he's going to set up his kingdom. And suddenly all this momentum builds up. And then, after Jesus feeds the 5,000, he goes up on top of the mountain and he takes Peter, James, and John with him. And what happens? Suddenly, here's Moses and Elijah. The glorified Moses and Elijah, both alive, and they're conversing with Jesus. And Peter, after he wakes up and the other 2 disciples wake up, Peter's in astonishment and he says, "Let us build 3 tabernacles for you. So you can just stay here." And suddenly the cloud overshadows the mountain. Moses and Elijah disappears, and God the Father says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And again, they're in astonishment. They're amazed. They are gripped by this overwhelming sense of awe with Jesus. But it doesn't stop there. He comes down from the mountain, and suddenly a man comes to him whose child is demon-possessed. It says the demon throws him down on the ground. He seizes, he convulses, he's foaming at the mouth. We can't stop it. It's even so brutal with him that it injures him. If you can heal him, please do it. You remember Jesus' response there in Matthew? He says, if you can. It's almost a bit sarcastic. The man says, if you can heal him, do it. Jesus, if you can? Really? If you can? Are we still there? And he has this response. He says, oh, faithless and twisted generation. How long will I endure you? You don't believe. If you can? Have you not seen all the things that I've been doing? And you say, if you can. The question is not if I can. The question is if I will. See, God can do those things. He can walk on the water. He can feed the 5,000 and many more. He can heal all the sick. He can raise all of the dead. But what is the central heart of God? What is the central plan of Jesus? You can imagine that even at this point, after that demon is cast out, that the disciples and all the crowds must be sitting there in absolute amazement because they're witnessing. This is not happening in some private area. This is happening in the open air, in the public, for all the multitudes to see. And that's where the text picks up. Look at verse 43. It says, and all were astonished. They're overwhelmed at the majesty of God. They're in absolute bewilderment about who Jesus is and the things that they are witnessing. It's as if everybody in the crowd is standing there with their jaw on the ground saying, what have we been witnessing? Because this crowd has been following Jesus. You remember when they got out into the boat and started going along the coast to get away from them, and the multitude starts running along the bank just to catch up, and that's when Jesus feeds the 5,000. They're there. They can see all of these things, and they're absolutely in astonishment at what He's done. And all that. And it says this, in the second part of verse 43, it says, but, a little change of pace here, but, while they were all marveling at everything He was doing, Jesus said to His disciples, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. Can you imagine that? All of these things that they're witnessing. And the text says, but while they marveled, Jesus said this, let these words sink into your ears. That saying, sink into your ears, literally means let it just sit there. Let it just sit there in your ear until it seeps into your head. If you're going to get a grip on one thing that I'm going to do here, don't focus on the fact that I raised the kid from the dead. Don't focus on the fact that I fed 5,000. Don't focus on all those other things. If you're going to let one thing sink into your hearts, let it be this. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. Isn't that amazing? Jesus could have just kept on performing all these miracles and had all these people singing His praises right then, right there, as they were, and it could have just grown and grown and grown. And as all this speed is building up for everything Jesus is doing, He puts a halt on everything, and He says, whoa, putting the cart before the horse. There's something you really need to pay attention to. Something far greater than these miracles. Something I'm about to accomplish. The Son of Man, the Son of God, this messianic title for Jesus. The one who has come from God, the one who walks on the clouds of heaven. He is about to be delivered into the hands of men. Now, at verse 44, when it says, let these words sink into your ears, it almost sounds like a suggestion, doesn't it? Let these words sink into your ears. But it's not a suggestion at all. In the original language, you can see when a command is given. It's called the imperative tense. The imperative. This is an imperative. It is a command. It's not merely, let this sink into your ears. It's this. You need to pay attention and you will listen to this. Get this through your thick skull. We've all heard that statement, probably from our parents, right? Right? Get this through your thick skull. And that's what Jesus is saying to them. Listen to this. I'm really about to change your paradigm of what you think about the Messiah. So let this sink deep into your thick head. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. So if there's one great truth, one great thing that Jesus would have his disciples focus on, what does he say it is? It's his death and his resurrection. It's that. If there's one thing they would focus on, it's that. I think right there, Jesus tells us what that diamond is that he's after. He tells us it's not the grains that you peck around like a rooster. No, it's this diamond over here. And you think if that rooster had understood the value of that diamond, he would have changed his tone? Wouldn't he have rejoiced? With that diamond, he could have bought all the feed he wanted. Could have gorged himself. Because if you get that diamond, you get everything. I think that's what Jesus is saying. If you're going to let one thing sink into your head, if you're going to go after one thing as if it was a precious jewel, it needs to be this. Matthew and Mark both tell us that Jesus talks to them about his death and his resurrection. He's not just astonishing them at the fact that he's going to be delivered over to the hands of men. No, he's going to be raised from the dead. I'm afraid that so many times we really do major on the minor things, don't we? So many times we get worked up about all of the secondary things and we major on the minors. Whereas Jesus would have our major focus be his death and his resurrection, be the gospel. We start focusing on all these other things and we spend our life like that rooster pecking around at all these grains when there's a diamond right there for us to base our entire life on. And yet we, like that rooster, set that diamond aside because I'd rather have one more barley corn than all the jewels in the world. So that's not me. Well, yeah, it is. It's me too. We do it all the time. We have all these vain pursuits that don't have God at the forefront. And we just peck around and we miss this. It seems like an easy point to get that Jesus is trying to explain to them. If there's one thing that you grasp onto and that you hold on to in this life, it's not going to be your education. It's not going to be your success in the school system or in the political system or in your career. It's not going to be those things. It's going to be one thing that you could devote your entire life to. Would it be the death and the resurrection of Jesus? Seems to be that's the focus of Jesus. It's not only the focus of Jesus, it's the focus of the Father as well. It's the focus of God the Father as well. Look at this. Let these words sink into your ears, verse 44. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. Delivered by whom? That's an important question for us to answer. Delivered by whom? Who was Jesus delivered by? Who was he delivered over into the hands of men by? Was he delivered over by Judas? Well, that seems to be the most obvious answer because Judas betrays him with a kiss. He hands him over to the religious leaders. Was it Herod who delivered him over into the hands of men? Because Herod wasn't there to rescue Jesus. No, Herod sent Jesus back to whom? To Pilate. He hands him over to the Gentiles, to the Romans. Herod's supposed to be a Jew. And then he hands him over to Pilate. So does Pilate hand him over to the hands of men? Does he deliver him over? Because it's Pilate who lets Barabbas go free, and it's Pilate who gives Jesus into the hands of the Roman soldiers who follow the command to crucify him. So is it Pilate? Well, the answer is yes, it's all three of them. You could add a fourth. You could say it's the religious leaders who hand Jesus over to the Romans, to the hands of men to be crucified. You could say it was them too. But I think the Bible gives us a more shocking answer here. While all of those are true on a basic level, on a surface level, do you know who it was who delivered Jesus over into the hands of men? It was not men. It was God. God delivered Jesus over into the hands of men. It's important that we grasp this here. To be delivered into the hands of men. Acts 2:23. You remember who preached that great sermon on the day of Pentecost? It's Peter, right? Peter's right here. Peter's right here in this situation that we're studying this morning. Acts 2:23, in Peter's great sermon there on Pentecost, he tells the people, he says, "This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. You crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." Romans 8:31 through 32. Many of you in here, you could probably quote this text to me. It says, "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for us all, how will He not also with Him graciously give us all things?" So who was it who delivered Jesus over into the hands of men? It was the Father. According to His definite sovereign plan, it was the Father. It's Jesus' great focus that He's going to be crucified and raised from the dead. That's why He says, let this sink into your ears. Get this into your thick skull. If there's one thing to pay attention to, it's the fact that I'm going to be crucified and raised from the dead. Apart from this, you have no life. You have no forgiveness of sins. You have no hope in eternity. When you die, you'll spend an eternity in hell apart from me. Without this taking place, if there's one thing that sinks into your head, it's got to be this great event. And this great event did not just happen. It has been God's plan from the foundation of the earth in eternity past, conceived in the mind of God, that He would hand over the perfect sinless Son of God to be crucified by wicked, lawless men on behalf of wicked, lawless men. You know what this tells me? Because Jesus is God. You know what this tells me? It tells me that Jesus knew absolutely everything that was about to happen to Him. Yet He did it anyway. Let that sink into our ears. Jesus knew everything that was about to happen to him, how he would be beat within an inch of his life, how he would be mocked, how he would be spat upon, how he would have a crown of thorns put on his head and beat down with a reed, and how he'd be strung up naked on a tree to be humiliated before the very people he created. Jesus knew that all of these things were going to take place, and he did it anyway. Folks, is there a greater love than that? You know, it's one thing for my family and I to go to Walmart at night and some thug to walk up to us in the parking lot and want to rob me of the little money I have in my wallet, and for him to point the gun at my wife, and in an instant I jump and I take the bullet. That's a reaction, isn't it? That's a reaction. There's love there, isn't there? That I would jump in front of that bullet. But in the end, that's a reaction. I hope I would do that for a complete stranger. I didn't know that was going to happen when I went to the parking lot. That didn't happen, by the way, but I wouldn't know. I'd never know, or else I wouldn't go. I didn't know that was going to happen. If I did, I'd avoid it. Jesus knows that the bullet is coming, and it's coming from the Father. And he doesn't just react. He takes it all in stride. And Jesus says, no one takes my life. What did he say? I give it. It wasn't the Romans who killed Jesus. You remember on the cross, it was not the spear thrust into his side that ended his life. It was when Jesus said, it is finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he breathed his last. No one took his life. He gave it. He knew all of these things were going to take place. The Father knew all of these things were going to take place. But Jesus loves us so much that he'd do it anyway. So while we might be amazed at these other miracles that Jesus is doing, feeding the 5,000, healing the sick, raising the dead, if there's one thing for us to wrap our lives around, to center our focus on, it's got to be the death and the resurrection of Jesus. That's his central focus. That's the Father's central focus. Is that the pulse of our hearts? Or when we leave here, will we go back to pecking at the grains? Or will we always have in our hearts that jewel, that diamond of what Jesus did? Is that going to be what sinks deep into our souls? You see, it's when people are changed by that great event, that's what changes somebody's life. When they finally open their eyes and they understand that God really does love them so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Isn't that the focus of Scripture? Isn't that the theme of Scripture? Is God sending his Son to redeem a people for himself to the glory of God alone? If there's one thing that we major on, it's got to be that good news. It's got to be the gospel. Now, there's a very interesting verse here, verse 45. Kind of shocking. It says this, but they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about this saying. Interesting set of words here too. But they did not understand the saying, and it was concealed from them. You could probably answer this question real accurately now. Concealed by whom? Was it their imaginations? It possibly, I guess. It could be their imaginations because they have all these thoughts about who Jesus is supposed to be. He's supposed to be David here and now. He's supposed to be the Messiah here and now to set up His kingdom. Maybe it's concealed. The truth for what He's saying is concealed from their thoughts because they have these preconceived notions about who Jesus is. But I don't think the text tells us that. It says it was concealed from them. Concealed. That's a passive participle. Plainly, it's what this means. Whenever you see that passive action being done upon somebody, it's almost always, the action of God on somebody. And so God conceals this matter from them so that, that's what it says. It says, so that they might not perceive it. Why does the Father not want them to perceive it at that moment? Because they perceive it later. I just read the verse where Peter says, look, He was delivered over according to the plan of God. So Peter does eventually understand it. Can you imagine the kind of bold confidence they had after they remember the words of Jesus and they see Him being handed over into the hands of men? And then they see Him that third day rising from the dead. Can you imagine the boldness that they must have had? Sure, because just a short time after that, they're out in the streets of Jerusalem preaching to the people who killed Jesus. Why? This man must have been the Son of God to have foretold us all of these things. But at that point, they're not ready to receive it because they're still going to try to prevent Jesus from being killed. We know that because of what happened there in the garden. When Jesus is handed over to the rulers of the synagogue, you remember what happens to the soldier? Peter takes out his sword and he swings at the soldier, and he cuts off his ear. Does anybody in here think that Peter was aiming at the guy's ear? It's not his purpose to cut the man's ear off. He's aiming for his head. He's a fisherman, okay? He's not a professional soldier. And he misses, and he cuts his ear off. And Jesus says, put away the sword. My kingdom's not of this world, or else you'd be carrying swords. Put it away. And he takes the ear and he puts it back on Malchus's head, and he's okay. And Jesus goes willingly. He says, why did you come with all these soldiers? Didn't you see me every day? I would have come willingly. This is what I came to do, is to be handed over to you. And while they bring these soldiers to take Jesus, He would have gone willingly. But the Father conceals it from the disciples because if they had understood, what do you think they would have done? They would have tried to prevent it. They would have tried to prevent Jesus from accomplishing the greatest thing He could accomplish for them. And they would have missed that jewel for the grain. Do we do that? That's really our question for today. Do we do that? Do we miss what Jesus has done for us and wrap our lives around that singular event and that person? Or do we focus on all these other things? There's so many things that we can focus on, and I don't have to enumerate them for us to apply that to our hearts. But just examine your heart right now and just ask yourself, is my life first and foremost concerned with Jesus and what He's done for me? Because if it's not, then we miss that thing, that jewel that Jesus is trying to let us sink into our hearts. Folks, if there's one thing that we should make ourselves about, it's got to be Jesus. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. I'd rather have Jesus than riches untold. Is that the pulse of our hearts? Or do we major on all the minor things? What would you do with the Lord today? I know that there are things in my heart that I have to confess to the Lord. When I preach a sermon like this to myself and I hear these words coming out of my mouth and they're all coming back and hitting me in the forehead, there are things that I have to confess to the Lord, and I say, Lord, I've probably concerned myself with some of these things far too much instead of you. Lord, I want everything that I am, everything that I'm about, everything that I do in this life to be about you. If there's one thing, Lord, that you would let sink deep into my soul, would it be this? Let it be you, Lord. Let that be our prayer this morning. Would you pray with me?